topic, as I said, is kind of a segue in some regard, because it's about people. It's about, oops, I didn't intend to do that. It's about a Futures Leadership Challenge, and the frame that we took here, the perspective we took, is diverse futures beyond the human. And there's three of us, and it's kind of an interesting setup because from a Eurocentric perspective, which we are trying to get away from somewhat. We have at the far west, we have Dr. Antonio Jimenez-Luque. He is at the University of San Diego, and he's in San Diego. On the other side, really other side, literally, we have Elissa Farrow, who's soon to be Dr. Elissa Farrow, just I think about a couple of days or weeks away from that. And she's at the Sunshine Coast, just in Brisbane. She's actually speaking from the future. I love that because she's the only one I think here who's already on the 28th of October. We are all sort of set in the past from her perspective. And myself, I'm kind of not in the middle, but somewhat in the middle. I'm in the call from Atlantic Canada. So I'm at Atlantic Coast, we've got the Pacific Coast, and we've got, I'm not sure what the coast officially is called other than Sunshine Coast. And we have three different perspectives on that. The basis of what we are talking about is the book that we recently published, Leadership for the Future, Lessons from the Past, Current Approaches, and Future Insights. And there's a bit of information where you can get that and the discount on that. We have 3 speakers today, but there's actually 21 people who contributed to that book. And if they all were speaking today, it probably would go into the middle of the night or take Elissa totally out of the night. And so we have 3 perspectives. One is the attempt to get to a broader definition of diversity in the context of also artificial intelligence. The second perspective, how we can broaden the concept of spirituality and connect the human with other perspectives in the universe. And finally, what could a diverse and inclusive leadership look like, and how can it work together to create a meaningful future? So the 3 of us will speak to those 3 perspectives, and I think Tony will start us off. So over to you, Tony. And if it's okay, I'll just flip through the slides, and you have to tell me next.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for putting this panel together, and it's a privilege to be also here with Elissa. And I love the previous presentations. I think they are very connected with what I'm gonna introduce here, because I'm gonna suggest this idea of trans-modernity. So since issues of environmental degradation have global effects and go beyond national borders, they cannot be solved with mainstream leadership approaches from the past. These leadership approaches from the past emphasize unilateralism, individualism, competition, and power accumulation. It's very leader-centered. So what is needed is a more collective approach that distributes power more equitable, power distributed, and fosters multilateralism and cooperation. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the right button here.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. But what's the problem about this collective and horizontal perspective of leadership? The problem is that this is not going to be enough because these causes of environmental degradation and climate change are rooted in this idea of Western development and a relationship of domination with nature that is not sustainable. Therefore, the solution is a leadership approach that goes beyond Western epistemology, culture, and ideology of development. I'm suggesting here a dialogue of cultures, epistemologies to transcend this modernity, space of modernity. This new perspective will combine ontologies and epistemologies from all around the world, and in particular from traditional communities that have proved for centuries that the relationship of respect for nature is more sustainable for the future generations. Next slide, thank you. So since these leadership theories from the past, again, individualistic, based on power accumulation for the leader or a particular country, and leadership theories from the present, even if they are more collective, but still very Eurocentric, we are proposing what will the leadership of the future that can cope with these challenges of environmental degradation look like. So the goal of this presentation is to advocate for an epistemological and cultural turn in leadership studies and build together the spiritual and intercultural leadership of the future, drawing from conceptualizations of traditional spirituality. I consider this concept very key, and I see the connection with the previous presentations talking about these informal institutions. So I'm suggesting this informal institution of spirituality. Next slide. I think this is next slide. Another one. Another one.
We can just go to slide 14. Yes. I think that was my stuff up. Sorry.
Yes, that one.
Everyone's seen a preview of my prepresentation. Sorry about that.
No, but this is holistic. I like it. We are talking about this.
Art.
Let's talk about spirituality. What is this concept? And I like it a lot, this idea of informal institutions. I think this is key because it's not about the technology, it's how we use it according to our values and ethic and morality. So spirituality, connecting the human with nature and the universe, so transcending the human. So we have this quote from Australian Aboriginal elder Uncle Bob Randall. He says, "We do not separate the material world of objects we see around us with our ordinary eyes and the sacred wall of creative energy that we can learn to see with our inner eye. While people separate things out, even the relationship between their minds and their bodies, but especially between themselves and other people and nature and spirit." This philosopher of modernity, Descartes, who with the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, separated the mind from the body. In an example of spirituality in the US, Black L, a Lakota medicine man, he said, "The forelegs and the wings of the air and the Mother Earth were supposed to be relative like. The first thing an Indian learns is to love each other and that they should be relative like to the forelegs." And Winona LaDuke, a contemporary leader, Native American leader, she says, "Native American teachings describe the relation all around, animals, fish, trees, and rocks, as our brothers, sisters, uncles, and grandpas. These relations are honored in ceremony, song, story, and life that keeps relations close to buffalo, sturgeon, salmon, turtles, bears, wolves, and panthers. These are our older relatives, the ones who came before and taught us how to live." And this concept of spirituality can be connected with leadership with this spiritual and intercultural approach. And spiritual and intercultural leader goal is to achieve consensus, even if achieving that laudable goal is tedious and time-consuming. It's honoring all things, connectedness. The leader recognizes a decision could never be ordered or imposed on the community and village. The community members respect the decision and outcome in large part because all voices are heard, valued, and considered. This consensus, it is not only practiced among people, but also with nature and the universe. And this is something key when we are still in this dominant paradigm where everything is very leader-centered. Additionally, a spiritual and intercultural approach views leadership as a process where leaders and followers are interconnected, they are not separated, with communities and society and all elements of the earth and the universe. Focuses on keeping all persons and natural elements in healthy interdependence, which is translated in inclusiveness, participation, and a responsible and sustainable use of resources. Understands the complexity and ambiguity of human relationships in general, particularly related to different cultures, knowledge, and meanings. And here, this is key, and follows a process of sense-making regarding our relationship with the earth, because leadership understood as a process of sense and meaning making. This from seeing the planet as a resource to be exploited without connection with human beings to a conceptualization of the earth as our mother. Next slide, please. So this style of leadership will be central, connected with organizations. It will be central to be more participatory and sustainable organizations and societies for present and future generations. Additionally, this leadership perspective can contribute at a broader level that transcends the space of the organization to create a new way of making sense and meaning of the earth and the use of natural resources for profit. So far, spirituality and leadership has been focusing within the organization without connecting with society and nature and the universe. And a spiritual and intercultural leadership that will teach us that the planet is our global home and nature our original mother. So in conclusion, I try to shed a little bit of light about this idea of the future of leadership, bringing this concept of spirituality to the leadership field, and particularly how can we apply it to organizations. The spiritual and intercultural approach of leadership will be built through spirituality and intercultural dialogue. So through this intercultural dialogue, we can try to transcend the paradigm of modernity. And I think this is key for environmental issues. And this endeavor is immense, and we have already started running out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio. And apologies again for putting my slides right in the middle of your presentation. If you could go back to slide 7, thanks, Thomas.
Slide 7.
So one more before, one more.
Okay.
Go back once. Thank you. This is it. Thank you, everybody. It was really a wonderful beginning to hear Antonio's presentation, because it sort of dovetails a bit into another perspective of leading the future, which is what I examined as part of my research, which was looking at organisational adaptation in the context of artificial intelligence, and settled my research in a 20-year future, and did a lot of participatory process, including the last World Federation Conference in Mexico City 2 years ago, and it seems amazing what happened since then. So for me, my talk relates to the concept of diversity and what artificial intelligence might do to the concept of diversity in an organisational setting. And I wanted to start the process off by making a reference to Article 1 of the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, which talks about culture, taking diverse forms across time and space. And this diversity is embodied in the uniqueness and plurality of the identities of the groups and societies making up humankind. With some of the development that's occurring in AI, and the concept that in the future, like one of the previous speakers in the previous session was talking about, that the future of work might look quite different, where perhaps there might be models where humans aren't as involved as much in certain sectors. I think it's important for us to be reminded of some of these base principles, and in particular the connection now when we're thinking of diversity in a workplace setting, giving agency also to Antonio's perspective around giving nature, the ecology, our planet a seat around the table as well. But that might be subject to some further research for me in that area. Next slide, thanks. Diversity at the moment is made up of a number of different elements. So there's been a range of different workplace diversity policies and regulations in a range of different countries for many years. And the typical aspects of diversity and broad definition covers aspects to do with, age, ethnicity, disability, your values, your beliefs, your gender, sexual orientation. Could be diversity in terms of personality, or in a work context, your educational skill or competence. And also there's diversity in the group that you may identify with. But there is a shift in that definition when we start to expand it to groups that potentially are non-human. So next little animation, just next one click, Thomas. So this is where we bring in the diversity elements of our future, where leaders of the future will need to sort of consider what is the place of the human versus non-human in a workforce setting, especially if artificial intelligence instances end up becoming a concept of sentient or not. So sentient is defined originally by Kurzweil, who was expecting that it would be happening in the near term, sentient meaning that it would be almost human-like. And therefore be a potential challenge for us to determine what degree of rights do our AI and robots have when potentially they actually are have a form of sentience. Next slide, please. So this is the query and the quandary that we have as leaders as we move forward, that as we heard even from the previous forum, that the World Economic Forum's predicted AI is going to be a real driver for change in employment trends over the next decade. And also by 2030, large consulting companies such as McKinsey has estimated that there'll be an economic output of AI of $13 trillion. And quite a tangible contribution to global GDP by that time. However, for us, when we're thinking about what true AI is, or in the context of more of a sentient AI, true AI, as per the definition, exhibits more of human-like intelligence and the ability to use human-like judgment and decision-making. As opposed to machine learning tools at the moment, which are mainly there to speed up the prediction rates, bring more efficiency in that space, and also identify patterns, but they're not necessarily exercising any great judgment at the moment to reach conclusions. So there is going to, at some point, be a shift in that space. Which means for us that as part of my research, there were a number of different scenarios that were identified which challenge concepts of diversity and also people's perception of who the worker is in the context of work, and what is their rights, or what is their considerations that are required. In one of the workshops I ran, it was interesting, where people gave artificial intelligence as a persona, futures persona, voice around the table, and they thought that at some point in the future, we may actually have a continuum where machines might actually provide leadership for certain decisions, and then the humans may need to follow. In one workshop that I conducted at the Asia Pacific Futures Network, some of the participants in my workshop, where I too use causal layer analysis, were suggesting a metaphor of the humans become the laptop, which I sort of found quite interesting when we're thinking of organisational operating models of the future, where at the moment it is very human-centric models, and at the moment, given AI doesn't have sentience, the whole concept of machines leading teams or taking accountability for certain tasks is a bit of a different sort of switch to our mind, and pushes out our thinking into areas that perhaps we're unfamiliar. Next slide, please. So what's been known in terms of the work around embracing diversity in organisations in a current state process, and building more of an inclusive culture within an organisation, which does take time and commitment and understanding, is that when diversity of even the current human resources is managed really well, we'll tend to see quite a different sort of energized change culture and value-driven culture than one that when it is actually managed poorly. So in particular, a couple of the highlights when diversity and inclusive cultures are generated within an organisational setting, we'll tend to see more information sharing, we'll tend to see more people feeling empowered, and innovation that will come from people not having any perceived boundaries and instead being open to dissimilarity and actually really embracing and wanting that to actually occur. Productivity through various forms of research has also been seen to increase if we have a really beautiful opportunity to embrace and build an inclusive culture where the judgment, which sometimes permeates organisational settings based on those diversity dimensions that I mentioned earlier, are front and centre. The opposite is true, of course, when there isn't a deliberate approach to building an inclusive organisational culture. We'll see poor communication, we'll see power plays, we'll see discrimination, we'll see conflict, and we'll also see some areas where productivity might decline. And interestingly, through my research, where I was getting participants to explore their mindset of the future using Dweck's fixed and growth mindset. It was interesting when people were more in a fixed mindset, which I tend to align with the concepts of basically not being open to inclusive cultures, that there was scenarios identified that actually led to discrimination between human and machine. And I know some of these concepts, again, might seem a bit wacky when sometimes now within organisations we can't get that inclusive culture, but my research was set in the future when some of these scenarios are more likely to actually occur. And if I, for example, my performance was based on the fact I had a really thorough collaborative working relationship with this sentient AI, and then for some reason that sentient AI was decommissioned, would I actually feel grief that my colleague and the person, the metaphorical person, our AI, the sentient being that I've been so dependent on for my work, if that relationship is different, what does that mean for me? So it starts to raise thoughts. And for me, when I was thinking about diversity, it also led to areas of humans working with animal colleagues, especially in environments where the security dog or the guide dog is connected and part of the owner, and though the dog is not human, but it still has incredible value, and they become one. And in the future, we too will maybe become a little bit more connected to some of the technology systems, but hopefully we'll still remain connected to our broader spiritual and ecological basis. Next slide, please. So the 6 principles of leadership I developed through collaborative practice over the course of my study is a challenge for leaders of the future to consider if they're wanting to build workplaces that have got a blend of both human and AI at some point within their future models. And firstly, leaders of the future need to be open to understanding what AI is. So artificial intelligence can be misunderstood. It can also be perceived as almost like a black box that no one except for the programmer will actually understand. However, there are ways of unpacking and understanding and making transparent what AI is, and also being open to what it can do to enable more positive futures, or what it can do to actually impact that. So first of all, leaders of the future need to be open to what AI is and also understand its own diversity and the layered implications that come from that. So ethical considerations, the cultural issues that will emerge within an organisation, legal and regulatory pieces. So if our AI made a wrong decision and then there was an impact to the business, whose fault is it? These are all really big questions that many researchers at the moment are studying and grappling with. Leaders of the future also need to be able to sensitively manage emotional responses in themselves and others, because these changes that are possibly coming into our organisational settings, and in some organisations have already arrived, bring an emotional response. Like we as humans have valued a work process. There's many people that value their own personal work ethic, and it gives them a sense of purpose. What does that mean if we're going to change that dynamic? And so we need people to be able to, in leadership positions in particular, manage emotional responses, but also encourage that, for want of a better word, emotional intelligence and learning in others. The final three related pieces relate to concepts of bringing in more anticipation and futures thinking into workforce design and adaptation, which is at the moment reasonably siloed in many organisations, where the automation strategy is developed separately to the cultural strategy. And I really believe that needs to be joined up. And within the chapter of the book that we collaborated together on, there's an approach to an anticipatory form of workforce design. Part of that approach is, of course, questioning what leadership is and redefining it, including the role and power structures. We've seen leadership change over time from being more command and control structures to concepts of facilitated leaders or leader as servant sort of concepts. So, what does that mean if we add additional elements of diversity and inclusion within our organisation? Finally, the piece that relates to the fact we need to encourage people to have space to explore and experiment and be one and build that new context within the organisation. And whether that means that people decide to opt out of certain workplace settings or opt in is part of the process that organisations will need to manage. Last slide, Thomas. So this, to me, is just where I want to leave my presentation on, which is something that came for me as a sort of summary of what I hoped out of my doctoral research, is that my metaphor for the future is that AI is more of an integral part of paradise, so as opposed to something that is the opposite. And the images that you can see are just some images that I thought just were really demonstrating that metaphor, where in that future paradise, humans and AI have a relationship of mutual trust, a bit like a good friend, linked to the joint goal of empowerment of humanity and kindness to our planet. And I really am hoping that AI investment will shift from that more individualistic AI utilisation, which is based on economic profitability, to one that is more collective and ethical. And the example that you can see there, a child's view of an octopus cleaning robot, the gentleness of that robotic arm picking those tomatoes, and then finally Stanford's humanoid diving robot that could be really helpful in understanding our oceans more and keeping our planet clean. So I'll throw to you now, Thomas, and you will have to skip ahead as well.
I will do that. I will just briefly comment on that image with the tomatoes, because it was really interesting how you introduced that as gentle, and it shows my bias, because when I saw that, I was thinking, oh, what is he doing with the tomatoes? They're gonna be squished. But it's a little soft tissue there, so it's interesting. Bear with me. I'm gonna run through the slides back to my part of the presentation. So the things that you mentioned, Elissa, in terms of the integration of those technologies, we talked about redefining leadership values, redefining values in general, and being one. This is really a major part of my interest over the last couple of decades. In one of the chapters in the book, where I looked at how can values, how can meaning as concepts inform our understanding of leadership. And sort of in anticipation of the outcome of that chapter, I'm proposing that values will be important and will be integral in moving us forward into a more complex future. People make future. We already heard that in the previous presentation. And so, people are, if we follow Viktor Frankl, very much in quest for meaning, in quest for values. They're motivated by values. So that has been core to my work. I was fascinated by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and his work. Those of you who are familiar with him, he was a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp. He was a psychotherapist and psychiatrist, and right from the get-go, even before he was in concentration camps, he was starting to be convinced that man's and man in our modern world, gender neutral, man's motivation really is their search for meaning. In a very quick kind of summary, he thought of he discovered three dimensions of values. First and foremost, which is kind of also relating to previous presentations, people find meaning in what they do, in their work mostly, but it doesn't have to be paid work. If you do something meaningful, you find values and meaning, you realize values. The second dimension is experiencing something as meaningful while you work or outside of work. So there's the romantic relationships, the relationships with nature, the relationship even with technology, with sentient systems, can be very meaningful. I love this idea about grieving, losing a part of that. And the third one, the third dimension, is a bit more difficult in the sense that originally Frankl, of course, wrote and did his research about clinical kind of settings. And his idea was that some people, particularly people who find themselves terminally ill, can't move anymore, will have difficulty doing work, doing something meaningful, just because they don't have the simple capacities of doing something with their arms, legs, or whatever. And they might also be very much restricted in experiencing something as meaningful. Many of them are deprived of the opportunity to go out into nature, to work with others. They are limited to what they see and experience in their bed or wherever they find themselves. So that's the original idea, and his experience that some people, in spite of all that, despite the catastrophe that they went through, the crisis they went through, and even his own experience in the concentration camp, despite of all that, people can and people did maintain a meaningful attitude. And that certainly is helpful to live through those experiences. Now, those three dimensions of values have been very informative on my work, and I've for many years, together with others, worked on translating these dimensions into the work field, the work area, and into leadership in particular. I don't have the time to really go into in depth. In the book chapter, I write a bit more about that. In case studies around the world, we were trying to identify how individual values and organizational values, and paying attention to integrating those, how that actually literally pays off in terms of work efficiency and performance. And my particular lens at the time was to study project management as a tool of managing organizations and processes, and trying to figure out what individual organizational values can contribute to the value of project management. And in our findings in those case studies, we found that the more individual and organizational values are aligned, and the more people felt they could meaningfully engage with the work, with the people that they worked in, and in terms of the attitudinal values, even if the workplace undergoes changes and challenges, to the level that they could make sense of those changes and challenges, they would also engage actively in the change of the organization. So it really kind of directly connects, in my mind, to what I call, or what we can call, futures-oriented leadership. And just highlighting a couple of features there. Part of the values that we need to keep in mind, I think, of the field and of what we do is that there's not just one future, there's multiple futures. The futures that we consider are open. We don't know exactly where the limits are, where they go, but many of those are potential futures. And a big sort of shift in the workplace, I think, is to get people to think about futures and something that is potential, and that there is something more than just continuing the trends of what we see today. We don't really know. So, okay, I'm looking at my screen, but I need to click on this one here. So in the final chapter of the book, where it kind of all comes together, I was looking at, so how do we then together as human beings in work with sentient beings in exchange with a wider kind of environment, even with animals, with the flora, and who knows, in the future it might be other species from outside. How do we co-create meaningful futures with all that? And moving forward with the values focus, I think the first step in doing that together is really to enter discourse and conversations about what are the values that we want to focus on and that we hold dear. And in doing so, we have to respect the diversity that we were just talking about, including different humans, but going beyond humans, include sentient systems and so forth. And we know in the futures field, we know that in leadership, it's also sort of a tradition for several years that narratives play a major role. It's not just about facts and goals, it's about the narratives that we put those facts and goals in, or that we create around those. So creating values descriptions around those values is important. Creating narratives of relevant potential future scenarios, and all kinds of scenarios, not just keep with the projected or even the probable, but expanding it into the possible or even preposterous scenarios for future. And the part of the idea is, of course, to and now my little pictures of you all is in the way of part of my slide here. So what we're really getting at is co-creating something that we think is preferable. As I often tell my students, if you don't engage with the future, with what you want in the future, somebody will do that for you. So it's up to all of us to work on creating what we prefer to do, being open to that. The future might evolve in different ways. So there are different steps that we can go through, and I don't think we need to go through all the details here. But one of the key opportunities here is for all of those working together in an organization, in a team, or on a national level, or even planetary level, is to create groups who work on values, who work on those descriptions, and then use those descriptions and values to develop a leadership approach that is oriented towards realizing those values. And I'm just using the Futures Wheel here as one of the tools that is extremely helpful to think about, a certain event or trend. And in the context of the values descriptions that we do have, then think about, what might those implications of the, where's my little arrow here, of the event or trend might be, and then you come up with implication descriptions. And for each of those implications, we might then identify as teams what the scenarios are, and based on those scenarios, identify which of those are the ones that we want to work towards, and then create a comprehensive leadership strategy for that. But fluid, keeping in mind that we don't know what the future exactly is, and keeping in mind that the future is open. I'll stop here because we're already over time, and I wanted to again show the book, and if people want to need to get more information, they can certainly send an email to me. Now I'm just looking for the chat so I can put my email address in there, and send it to everyone. So there we go. So I think we do have a little bit of time, and it's a small group, so it doesn't take too long. Are there any questions to either one of us? And I'm going to stop share the screen for now. Any questions? There's not much participation, but those who are here, any questions?
Okay, I have a question. First, I want to thank you. Can I go on?
Sure.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much. Very informative, very insightful for the three of you. First, but I have two comments. The first one for Antonio. He mentioned spirit, and thank you very much. He agreed with me about the importance of informal institutions, and also he highlighted a very important issue about the multiple perspectives about spirituality. But just one comment, because you mentioned spirituality as an institution or as an informal institution. I'm just I would just to raise a point here that institutions usually are reductionist. If you want to institutionalize something, you have to reduce it, you have to put it in space and time, while spirituality is about expanding our existence to other horizons. So maybe it's better to say, for example, spirituality inspired institutions, but spirituality itself is always broader than institutions. This is just a point to raise. My question also to both of you, Elissa and Thomas, is about the sentient AI beings, let's say. I don't know to what extent this is possible. I know that in technology now there are researchers, they try to make those new, let's say, robots or whatever machines recognize things and then maybe have some sort of emotions. But we know that they are made; they are not natural. Let's say. I don't know to what extent, because I don't know. Till now, I couldn't see that dealing with a dog or even with a donkey or with a cat is similar to dealing with a robot. Because I know that this report is, I don't know. I mean, personally, I cannot even, I cannot imagine that this is a real sense. Even if the robot will cry or do something, I know that this is fake or this is artificial. But the cat, I know that this is real, this is natural. So this may create some sort of, well, people will not be that much ready, let's say, to deal with that. I'm not sure about this. I'm just asking because it's like it creates little bit of confusion. So that's why I want to hear more from you about what do you mean exactly by sentient beings, and how they are really sentient, and why people will believe that they are really sentient.
And I think that's the wonder of futures research and futures studies, is the ability to talk about scenarios that might even be outliers. And I think the sentient process is something that people have aspired towards for many years, and is going to take more time. But part of the challenge for me when I was thinking about different forms of leadership, where even now there's some different companies that have got instances of AI without the sentience, but they're taking direction from AI based on that predictability and that predictive power. And so then the sort of scenario was extended even further, that if eventually there is a degree of sentience and reliance and almost empathy connected to this process, which you can see in children connecting through to their companion, or in aged care, and some of the great work that's coming out of some of the Japanese institutes at the moment about robotics in aged care for companionship, for example, that people, regardless of full sentience or not, will get a form of connection to their AI instance and feel, and potentially actually feel a bit impacted if that being actually left. So for me, it was part of the expansion of the concept of diversity into different realms, when I see, even in an Australian context, that animals and plants are discriminated against, I guess, if you can call it that. And so at some point technology may as well. People have done research into even people hitting or being mean to robots in some research options, and people sometimes feel a degree of, maybe we shouldn't beat this particular robot up. So there's that sort of view, which is interesting, on what community and cultural values are. But that's where I was going with this concept, that at some point we may need to embrace it, or at least embrace people's attachments that they might actually form on their machine, where people now can't live without their smartphone without feeling like part of their body's gone. So maybe it's a bit similar in an organisational setting. But yeah, it was just a challenge, I think, to stretch our thoughts.
And I think, Elissa, you pointed it out really well, in the sense of there's two parts of that coin. There's the one part, of course, is the sentience, and how sentient technological systems can be, how much feeling they can true feeling from our perspective they can develop. You talked about you talked about fake feelings versus true feelings. That's one side of the coin. The other side is, and Elissa, you pointed it out, is our feelings towards non-humans, animals, plants, or technical systems, be they sentient or not. And I think it's a leadership question, or a leadership challenge, to expand our thinking, our bias towards being more inclusive. And we're still struggling even with the basic human diversity and inclusiveness. We're still struggling with that. But in 20, 30, 40, and more years, I think what we're walking towards is an expansion of that inclusiveness into what we were talking about, and that includes robots, technology. The care robots that Elissa talked about, to me, are a perfect example of that. There are not yet as present in the Canadian context, for example, but I read those things with interest, because it is a question: how much of a role do we want them to play in our caretaking kind of society? New Brunswick, Canada, is dealing with a huge challenge when it comes to demographics, and probably not just our country, and caretaking. The pandemic has demonstrated that. how few resources we do have. So it's very easy to include technology, or it's very likely that we will use technology to expand that. And it's a leadership challenge to open people up for that and to make decisions about, you know, how our values might change. We want them to change, and so forth. So yeah, it was just my quick response to that question. I'm not 100% sure what we're supposed to do in terms of winding this down. I know that officially we are about 20 minutes over.
Yeah, I think there's Sophia Darwood is in participants, and I think they're meant to be next. So whether we hand over, but I also note that in the participants there's a conference B has taken hosting. So I guess we can leave it with the host.
Okay. So I just say thank you very much again, Tony and Elissa, for doing that particular, Elissa in the middle of the night, early in the morning, and thank you very much for Mu'tazim to staying on after his presentation, and for Sophia to listen in a little bit to our presentation, and we'll just stop here and allow the next ones to take over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.